Hello everyone. The topic of today's discussion is the connections between income, fertility, mortality, and human capital. Accordingly, we have the following objectives. Economic development and fertility. So how economic development influences fertility, and also in turn how fertility impacts economic development or economic progress. Third objective is also that we discuss the importance of mortality in this regard. Lastly, we talk about the importance of human capital in all of this. Let us start with a couple of basic points here. We all know that population growth is a major economic policy issue as well as is a matter of major socio-economic, socio-political tensions. However, the slow population growth is more of a recent phenomenon. To understand population growth, there are two main important concepts. One, fertility rate, the other one is mortality rate, both of which you have learned in previous modules. These two concepts are critical to understand demographic transition across countries, across continents. As far as demographic transition is concerned, there are certain important differences between developed countries' experiences and developing countries' experiences. For example, if we compare the developing and developed countries, we see that with rapid decline in mortality rate, especially in the case of developing countries, fertility rate becomes a very critical factor in order to understand demographic transition or in order to explain population growth, so to speak. However, we need to remember that fertility rate tends to be relatively stickier. Okay, now we present a brief overview of the relationship between income and fertility rate and the relationship between income and mortality rate. As you can see on your screen, in this particular scatter plot, we basically present the correlation between income and fertility rate. We are measuring children per woman on the vertical axis, and we are measuring GDP per capita on horizontal axis. As one can easily decipher that there is some sort of negative correlation between these two variables, which basically means as you move along the income axis upward, you see there is somewhat downward trend in fertility rate, implying that higher countries tend to be the ones with lower fertility rate in general. Why we are saying in general? Because there could be higher income countries, in countries in the similar range of income, for example, with varying degree of or varying ratio of fertility rates. If we move to the next slide, where we are presenting the correlation between or some sort of association between income and mortality rate, here too we see a somewhat negative relation, implying that with rise in income, there is in general a decline in mortality rate. So from these two graphs, we are basically getting a sense that there is somewhat negative correlation between income and fertility rate and income and mortality rate. In this next segment, what we talk about is how economic development or economic progress influences fertility, and also how mortality can be very important in this regard. Before we move on, let us look at this particular graph. What we see here is we are measuring in year on the horizontal axis, time, and the share in global population on the vertical axis. This graph basically represents that how the contribution of these continents changed over time in the share of global population. Generally, we have a perception that high population is mainly an issue of Asia or countries in Africa. But if we look at historically, that is not the case. Also, this kind of graph helps us to understand that just because you have high population in certain parts of the world, that per se need not be an alarming thing because things do change over the years. Just take a look at this graph and see how Europe's contribution to global population changed over the years, especially, let's say, over the 19th century. And it is only perhaps in the second half of the 20th century that you see the contribution of Asia and Africa in global population tends to be rising. And this can be easily seen from this graph. Okay, so before we proceed further, let us just quickly understand there are some key differences between developed countries and developing countries with regard to the demographic transition or population growth changes, etc. One of the main factors that really distinguishes these two parts of the world is that whereas for developed countries, these countries had to wait for longer time because they were having a lot of trial and error with their medical science, innovations of new medicines, cure. Many of these things were readily available for the developing countries. As a result, what happened? Compared to the developed nations, today's developing countries took much shorter period to have a faster reduction in mortality rate. The other factor that played a key role in case of some of the today's developed nations, that in their case, there was a late years of marriage. Therefore, their fertility rate never really touched the high level as we see in developing countries. At the same time, in case of the developed countries, today's developed countries, their birth rate or fertility rate fell relatively slowly, but fertility rate in general also tends to be relatively stickier. So when it comes to developed countries, we not only have better medicines, access to better medicine, access to better technology in a shorter period of time compared to the developing countries, we also have a lot of organization, public institutions, international organizations such as World Health Organization and so on to guide us about the issues of public health matters and so on. Now, while this is a good thing, this also led to another kind of problem because therefore, in the case of developing countries, what we have is mortality rate declines very fast compared to the developed nations in their respective stages of demographic transition. However, fertility rate being relatively stickier, the whole story of population growth becomes critically dependent on how fertility rate moves over the time. And now we shall move on to the next segment. But before that, there is a question for you. Think about this question. Identify one key difference between the experience of today's developed countries and today's developing countries with regard to their respective demographic transition. So as I pose this question, I hope you can find out the answer of this question from our preceding discussion. Of course, one of the key differences perhaps would be that while developed countries need to wait for a relatively longer period of time for their mortality rate to decline because they had to go through a lot of trial and error as they were inventing or discovering newer medicines or newer techniques. Fortunately, that was not the case with developing countries because some of those things were internationally available. Now, we said in our previous discussion that birth rate or fertility rate generally tends to be relatively stickier. What could really explain that? As far as the birth rate is concerned, there is something called an inertia. And this inertia can be categorized into two kinds of inertia. One is macroinertia, the other one is microinertia. Let's think about the macroinertia first. Think of a country with very high fertility rate and very high mortality rate as well. Such countries will tend to be such where you have relatively younger population, more in their whole population. Relatively younger population will be in a larger share in such countries. Now, of course, in such countries, even if, let's say, fertility rate slows down in different age brackets, the overall population growth will take a longer time to slow down because most of the population is in the younger age bracket. As a result, fertility rate will tend to be relatively higher. Now, this is more of a aggregate structural situation that we have here, primarily determined by the composition of age of the population, guided by both the fertility rate and mortality rate being relatively higher. Come to the microinertia. Now, in microinertia, we have two aspects of it. One, children are generally seen as consumption good or something that people are generally happy about. So these economists may identify as considering children as consumption good, that there is some sort of intrinsic value of having children. On the other hand, children can also be seen as investment good. Yes, you heard it right. Children can be seen as investment good in the sense that they can be considered as some sort of security for future. Let's think about how children are seen as a security or investment good. Why so? Human beings generally prefer some sort of security because their life is filled with uncertainties. They don't know what will happen in the future. Now, as far as economic securities are concerned, people would want to ensure that also pretty much. In this case, it is argued the children are considered as asset par excellence. Now, keep aside children. What can be really a source of security in your crisis or during your old age, for example? Well, if you have something like pension, savings scheme, insurance, other facilities, institutional supports, etc., then you have a situation where you have a lesser insecurity kind of issue. So if those things are there, you don't really need to worry so much about the security during your crisis or old age particularly. But in developing countries specifically, some of these things are missing. For example, you have the issue of missing markets of insurance, mainly because we have large unorganized sector, huge proportion of our labor force is actually involved in the informal activities, and also highly agricultural dependent economy. We are also highly agricultural dependent economy in terms of the labor force. So in these case, what happens is it takes longer time for insurance market to develop. So we have something like a missing market in this regard. Developing countries generally tend to be that way. It takes longer time for their case, the insurance market and other markets to develop because of these reasons. Also, there is another constraint. Low income in low income countries, low income will tend to generate low savings, and therefore for future security, you will have an issue. The other aspect is, even if you have asset, there could be some sort of social norms that people may not really be willing to encash their asset just like that. Sometimes it is also considered that if you really have to sell off your asset to take care of your life and to survive, you actually feel psychologically that it's a very bad time that I had to sell off my asset. Therefore, there could be social norms which could hinder that conversion of asset into cash. Now, given these constraints, children, of course, become very reliable, comparatively more reliable and viable option in terms of getting some sort of security for crisis or old age. However, in this regard, both mortality and fertility come together and form the issues of uncertainty. Think about it. People would like to have security for their future, and let's say they have a child for that. Now, what is the guarantee that they will have the security just because they have a child? What all could be the issue? A, the child may die very early. There could be issue of infant mortality. The child may also die at an early age because of childhood disease. B, when the child grows up, she or he may not have higher income or such income capability earning so as to support her or his parents. And C, this is also a social issue, where the children may break their tie with their parents, which means they may not look after their parents even though, let's say, they have higher income and so on. You see on your screen, it's a scene from that famous Hindi film Lage Raho Munna Bhai, where a lot of old people were staying together in a house because their children did not take care of them. Now, what happens in this case? Because of these matters, you face some sort of uncertainty that just because you have children doesn't mean that you'll be looked after. Thus, we have a very interesting issue here. In one hand, there is this probability whether you'll be taken care of by your child. On the other hand, every parent would have some sort of mental threshold. Okay, let's think about this way, that you would want a 90% probability or 95% probability or assurance that you are taken care of by at least one child. On the other hand, there is this probability that a child may not take care of you. Remember the reasons? A child may die very early, a child may not have enough income, and the child may actually break the tie. Now, parents would tend to compare these two kinds of probabilities and perhaps decide how many children should they have. Therefore, they would try to ensure that at least they have maintained that threshold level of probability of being taken care of by one child, at least one child. Secondly, this is where an interesting issue comes in, social norms. There is a tendency in our society among the parents that not only they want to be taken care of, but more specifically, they want to be taken care of by a son. So it is not just the probability whether the child will take care of the parents. The parents would actually love to be taken care of by a son. Now these two together, influences their fertility choices. How? Let's say a family has 2 children and both of them are girl child. The family would still want to have one more just to ensure that what if there is a boy coming up? Because of the social norm, the gender bias that we are talking about here. You remember that famous film Bhagwan, the photo that you can see on screen. It was a story of rich parents not taken care of by rich children. The story kind of showed they were taken care of by an adopted child. But recall, even that adopted child was a male child, was a man, not a woman. However, in the previous slide when we showed that scene from Lage Raho Munna Bhai, fortunately there was a girl who was taking care of the elderly and elderly people. It seems that culturally also we have made some progress over the time. So, we discussed what are the factors that could really influence your fertility choices. But why then would fertility rate tend to be relatively more stickier? Let's say, overall in the economy, there is a decline in the mortality rate. But people at large may not know about it. The information may not have percolated to the ground level. People need to have that information in their mind when they are making their family planning. So even though in reality, mortality rate might have gone down, people may not know. So they may still feel, what if a child doesn't survive? So they might plan accordingly. So there is an issue of information here. Secondly, suppose a family belongs to a relatively poorer region. The probability that their children will have enough earning capability or enough earning to take care of their parents would be relatively lower if the family resides in a relatively or economically poorer region. Again, what is the guarantee? Just because the children have enough income or they survive, that they will fulfill their parental obligations? And finally, as we discussed, there is a gender bias. So all of these put together will tend to make fertility rate relatively stickier. In short, even though there is economic progress, economic growth, a growth in income, the fertility rate may not follow the exact same rate. It may take longer to slow down. Okay, now it's your turn. What are the uncertainties that parents generally face when they consider children as their old age support? So I left all of you with a question. What are the uncertainties that parents generally face when they consider children as their old age support? We have discussed that. The child may die very early because of infant mortality or childhood disease. The child, when they grow up, when she or he grows up, may not have high income. And also, even if the child has high income, when she or he grows up, then maybe they may not take care of their parents. So these are some of the uncertainties that parents face. Okay. Now, economics is a very interesting and sometimes funny, because we have also modeled how people decide the optimum number of children that they are going to have. Just like anything in the world, the mainstream economics, rather the neoclassical economics, have theorized it in the following way. There are some costs involved when you have a child, direct and indirect, and there are some benefits of having a child. Now you bring cost and benefit together, you bring in your preference about having a child, and you also consider the cost side of it. Remember Micro 101, the budget constraint and the indifference curve. You can get them together, decide the optimum number of children that you're going to have. Now, with change in income, your constraints will differ, will alter, and so will be your optimal choice. What are the costs? Of course, there is a direct cost of having a child, but there are also indirect costs. For example, if you have a child, you have to spend time with the child. You have to give time to the child. As a result, the time that you're giving for the child is the time that you have to sacrifice from other kinds of works. Now consider the importance of rise in income in this regard. Let's say your income rises. What will happen? Now, this is where we have to add a caveat. It really matters whether the rise in income is coming from increase in property value or let's say increase in rental income and so on, or the rise in income is because of increase in wage income or your earning. Suppose it's an increasing income from property, then it doesn't matter much. But what if your hourly wage has gone up? In that case, it will affect the cost of having a child. Why? Remember, if you have a child, or if you have an extra child, let's say, you have to give extra time to the child. And in a situation where your hourly wage has increased, if you have to spend more time for the child, for the children, then you are sacrificing a relatively higher income. So the opportunity cost actually rises. Secondly, it really is important whose income in the family has gone up. Here comes the social and gender bias again. If it's a man's income that has gone up, it is as good as the increase in income due to property income rise. But if it is the women's income that has gone up, then the opportunity cost is affected. Why? Because due to the social norms, it is generally perceived that the household works and the child, taking care of the child, everything falls on the woman. So if it's the woman's income that is going to rise, then the opportunity cost of having one more child will be going up. But not the case if a man's income is rising, because the man is not supposed to, generally, as per the social norm and perception, not supposed to take care of the family matters, domestic matters rather. Okay, now we come to the section where we talk about how population growth will affect economic progress. This matter is something that we talk about every day actually. If you're traveling by train, buses, on the road, in the tea stall, at your drawing room discussion, everywhere people talk about because the population is high, economy is not progressing, income is low, and so on and so forth. But the matter is a little more complex than that. It's not that straightforward. So the commonly held belief is this, that large population leads to lower per capita income. But think about it. If you have more people, does it mean only more consumption? But it is also more production, isn't it? And when you have more consumption, it also generates higher domestic demand for the economy. So it is very difficult to say what will happen if there is an increase in population growth, an increasing population, unless we consider all aspects of it. Therefore, we say that population growth potentially can affect economic growth in either way, positive or negative. Now, what are the negative effects? One of the most famous negative effect that is considered in economics is the Malthusian view. We'll discuss that shortly. The other things that we know about, the other negative effects that we know about are from growth models. Some of the existing growth models suggest that while population growth may not affect the economic growth per se, but it can actually affect the level of income. Again, high population growth may have some sort of negative impact on savings. For example, if the population growth happens to be in the poorer segment of the society, and if it is the richer segment of the society who tends to be, relatively saving more, then this kind of population growth might actually affect the aggregate saving adversely. Again, if the population growth is relatively more concentrated among the poorer sections of the society, it will have adverse impact both in terms of poverty increase and also increase in inequality. Finally, there could be a lot of pressure on ecological aspect also. There could be environmental consequences because of higher population. But here also we need to add certain caveats. If you are interested, you can actually also search in Google and find out what is this idea of environmentalism of the poor. It does not necessarily mean that just because you have relatively more poorer people, it will always affect nature adversely. There is no such necessary one-to-one relationship. The matter is again complex. Let's quickly have an understanding of what is the Malthusian view. It's pretty simple. It's actually something that we talk about every day. What Malthus actually argued that when there is a rise in income above the minimum subsistence level, people tend to have more children. As a result, in the long run, labor supply increases, which brings down the wage back to the subsistence level. So in short, whenever there is a progress, people tend to have more children. As a result, the wage always comes back to the subsistence level in the long run. But this kind of idea might be true for, let's say, 14th to 18th century period. But our recent experiences kind of counter it. Because we have seen just because there is an increase in income, or just because there is economic progress, that does not necessarily imply people who have more children. Also, with upcoming of a lot of other institutional supports with economic development, the fertility rate might decline. Remember, the security for crisis or security for old age, if you have more institutional supports, better insurance and saving schemes, with economic progress, you need not have more children per se, necessarily. Now, also, the cost of children may go up with economic progress. And more importantly, with economic progress, we have also seen increasing dominance of nuclear family. That in itself also has affected fertility rate. Now, it's your turn. Following the Malthusian view, how would population growth impact the general level of wages in a society? So, I gave you this question. Following the Malthusian view, how would population growth impact the general level of wages in a society? Of course, whenever there is a population growth, that will bring down the general level of wages. That is what Malthus would argue. Okay, let's think about the positive effects of population growth. They're both demand-driven effect and supply-driven effect. With increasing population, what happens? There is a necessity that we have to feed more mouths. And remember, necessity is the mother of all invention and innovations. So with increasing population, there could be a demand for better technologies, more productivity. But then critics say that it is not population alone, but also together with higher income, both population and higher income together, they would perhaps ensure a better technology, more innovation, more research and development, and higher productivity. On the other hand, there is a supply side argument that when you have more people, you have increasing diversity, more brains to think about the issues that really matter for the society, then you have the higher probability of coming up with newer ideas. Think about a country like India. We have produced so many scientists. So it does not necessarily mean that if you have more population, it will always be bad for the society. Now, this is where the human capital becomes very important. That what is human capital here that we're talking about? Let's say in very simple term, the skilled labor force. You will have a successful implementation of a better technology. If you will have a better innovation also when you have more educated labor force, more skilled labor force. And this actually has a connection with the fertility choice. Think about it. When a family does not have too many children, just has 1 or 2 children, okay? They will really put their resource, their time, their energy, their thought to ensure that the child, 1 child or 2 children, they get better educated and they get, good kind of education, So as a result, this will really affect the country's human capital resource. Okay. So we have come to the end of our discussion today. We have the following take-home points from our discussion. Largely, we see that there is an inverse relationship between fertility and income and mortality and income. And therefore, we argue that there is a both-way causality or relationship between economic progress and fertility. And we also see that the impact of income on optimal choice of number of offspring can be captured using what we discussed, the choice-based neoclassical modeling. Other factors, for example, uncertainty, social norms, gender bias, these also play a very important role. The impact of population growth on economic progress is relatively more complex than thought otherwise. Finally, human capital and innovation might be very critical in this regard. And this is where the subject of economics, and for that matter, any discipline, can be very interesting because newer findings might actually challenge the existing ideas. Thank you.